Good evening. This is Craig Truglia, and this is Orthodox Christian Theology. And this is a very exciting show because we have with us today Dr. Schmidt from Fairfield University. And he is an excellent scholar who has done some real interesting work on Josephus and the historical Jesus. Linked to below is his book from Oxford University Press, Josephus and Jesus. And we're going to talk about how the cutting edge and text criticism of the Josephan writings has made available to us a treasure trove of historical information about the historical Jesus, and it's in fact very reliable. And so with that introduction, I just want to welcome you here. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Schmidt.
Craig, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's the pleasure is mine because the last couple of years, it just seems that the sort of breakthroughs we've had with some areas of historical inquiry are things that I thought the last 20 years we would never see. I'm not sure if you feel the same about that, because I would presume we cut our teeth around the same time with a lot of very ingrained, almost dogmatic views and text criticism, that this is just the best we know textually about a lot of historical subjects. And we're seeing a lot of these things be overturned lately.
I did not write my book intending to overturn anything. I thought I was going to embrace the consensus, and I believed the consensus and was surprised at what the data showed me.
And the consensus is that the testimony from Josephus about Jesus is too good to be true. It sounds too Christian from a Jewish writer, that it no way could be authentic. It's an interpolation. And I'm going to share on screen translations, and the key word is translations of the passage. And this is from your book, because turns of phrase of how we translate the terms kind of reveals to us that maybe this is not even a pro-Christian passage at all. It just incidentally historically proves that someone believed there to really be a Jesus Christ, and these things were imputed to him, even if it's something that Josephus did not believe. So I have it on screen so people could read the other passages, the positive and neutral glosses. But I think most compelling to the audience would be the negative gloss, which would be how we'd read this passage if we were to interpret the words from Josephus with negative connotations, because it gives us an idea of how Josephus was reporting Jesus Christ at his time in a larger part of the antiquities about false prophets and pretty much bad people he didn't approve of. And so being that's the case, according to your negative translation, and then we'll get into a little bit whether it's justified, what is the passage that we have here that you translated?
If we interpret the passage through a negative lens, which is justifiable to do, that Josephus uses many of these words and phrases elsewhere, all of the words and phrases elsewhere, pretty much, and sometimes he uses them negatively. Sometimes they're used negatively by other writers of a similar time period as Josephus. So if we use them negatively, if we view them negatively, then he begins by saying that Jesus was a certain Jesus, which in Greek carries this sense of contempt. You hear it a little bit in English translation too, but then he uses this interesting word, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where he says he was a doer of magical deeds. That's how you could take it negatively. It's a very ambiguous word. It does refer to supernatural things, but not necessarily good supernatural things necessarily. And then there's the phrase, he taught people who take pleasure in the negatively, I have it translated as truisms. And, this is a difficult phrase to translate in English, but Josephus likes the phrase to take pleasure or to receive something with pleasure. And when he uses it, he often uses it in a negative way, where he's trying to highlight that the person who is accepting whatever the object is doing so naively or foolishly or wickedly or something like that. And so you can see how you could view the passage as building this case for Jesus not being a particularly good guy. I don't think the passage is definitely negative. I think it's better to view it ambiguously and more neutrally, but certainly it's not openly positive about Jesus.
Now, the part about truisms seems contextually similar with how St. Luke speaks of Athens, and when St. Paul preaches there, that they're trying to listen to all the new things. So it's almost a frivolity of sorts. And so as we see here in the translation that you provide in your book, um, that it says that Christ led astray many Jews and the Greeks. He was thought to be the Christ instead of what many people really, he was the Christ, which would seem peculiar, but was thought to be the Christ, and some of these other things. And so that being said, in order for us to justify that, even because this is text criticism, right? We're borrowing, we're going to find from Syriac, from a quotation from Eusebius of the passage in the Greek, and a lot of these things in order to find these words and come up with this rendering of Josephus. In order for us to start doing that, let's discuss what are the earliest manuscripts of this passage that talks about the historical Jesus and Josephus, and what languages are they?
Josephus wrote in Greek, and this passage, it's contained in a book of his called the Antiquities of the Jews. And as far as the manuscripts go, it has very normal manuscript history. Josephus wrote around the year 94, 95 AD, but the earliest manuscripts we have of the Antiquities are from the 10th, 11th centuries. There's actually really only 3 primary manuscripts that we use for this portion of the Antiquities. Antiquities is so large, it's 300 something thousand words, that there's lots of manuscripts of other parts of the Antiquities, roughly the same age, but there's only 3 that cover book 18, where this passage is found. Some people find that alarming. There's this 900-year period where between when Josephus wrote to when we have our first copy. But there's a couple things I'll say about that. One is that's totally normal. That's very typical for Greek authors. But secondly, that's not all we have. In addition to these Greek manuscripts, we have more than a dozen quotations in Greek from other Greek authors going back to
Which
the
are
year.
verifiably dated even in the originals before them. So this would show that the passage itself must predate its earliest actual manuscript, because you have authors starting maybe as early as Origen, right, showing cognizance of the passage.
I would say probably the one we could definitively rely on, I think, would be
This Eusebius.
Eusebius around 313 AD. So that's pretty early, and we have very early manuscripts of Eusebius's work. So he's writing in 313. He quotes the passage 3 times in 3 different works of his. And the earliest manuscript of one of these works comes from the 460s. And that's an extraordinarily early manuscript. In fact, it's the second earliest literary manuscript that has a date, where the scribe actually wrote the date down. Most literary manuscripts, scribes didn't leave the specific date they were writing, so scholars have to kind of like estimate based on handwriting analysis. But this scribe left a date, but that's not even the earliest manuscript. There's another manuscript of a different work of Eusebius where he also quotes this passage about Jesus, and that's from 411, and it's the earliest precisely datable manuscript. So we have actually extraordinary manuscript witnesses when you view the manuscript witnesses as a whole, not just the manuscripts of the Antiquities themselves, but also quotations. And then, of course, we have translations from Latin, ancient Latin, and from Syriac. And all of that helps us to ensure the accuracy of the passage and reconstruct it.
And generally, people are not that skeptical of the authenticity of antiquities as a whole. It's more would be this passage particularly. And so, that being said, let's talk about Origen a little bit. Take a little detour. So Eusebius, we know, definitely has the passage. He mentions it more than once. But with Origen, he speaks of passages that are sort of nearby this passage, and otherwise, Origen says Josephus did not believe about Jesus being the Christ. And so the thing that sticks out to me is that Josephus' coverage of James the Great, the first bishop of Jerusalem, is something that comes up in Origen, but he kind of conflates things from other hagiography, like Hegesippus, about Josephus. But that being said, wouldn't this be the case that even if he's conflating things and quoting things by memory, that he must have read Josephus to be commenting on?
Yeah, I think I had a little lag there, so I didn't catch the whole question. You're talking about Origen and how he might conflate some things with Josephus with pseudo-Hegesippus. Was that the...
Yes, with Hegesippus.
Yeah. Yeah, Origen definitely knew Josephus's work, the Antiquities. He quotes from it, he knows it, he knows passages from it. But remember, Origen is a theologian. He's not a historian. So he is sometimes makes these brilliant observations about various aspects of intellectual life or philosophical or theological life. But he's not a historian, so he doesn't actually quote the Testimonium Flavianum, though he does quote the Antiquities. And some scholars have used that to cast suspicion on the Testimonium Flavianum. Origen wrote between 230 and 255 AD. So the argument goes, look, this guy clearly had the Antiquities. He's quoting from it. He's even quoting from passages sort of nearby the Testimonium Flavianum. Why wouldn't he explicitly quote from it? And their argument was that the only thing they can come up with is that it just wasn't there in the Antiquities. It was inserted at a later point by some other Christian scribe. I don't think that's a good argument, and my book reveals this because I do what I try to do is a comprehensive study of how Greek authors interpreted the Testimonium Flavianum, that passage about Jesus in Josephus. And it turns out that they didn't really think of it as this fabulously pro-Christian statement about Jesus. They viewed it very mundanely. They repeatedly highlight what we would think of are just inconsequential details, like the nature of Jesus's teaching, the number of his disciples, his chronology, the fact that Jewish culpability in the death of Jesus. They don't highlight what scholars normally find suspicious, like he was raised from the dead, he was the Christ, he fulfilled Hebrew prophecy. So if Origen was reading the passage the same way these other folks were, which seems very reasonable, they're all writing in Greek, then he wouldn't have much of a reason to quote the passage. It's not this fabulous passage about Jesus. It's, from Origen's point of view, it's this statement about Jesus that's kind of humdrum that he didn't find to be that useful.
Now, it's interesting if the point you make that the passage was interpreted by people not so positive, and people could read the book if they want more of the blow by blow coverage of that, exactly how that works out, how positive they interpret the passage or not. I think the clincher, though, is the Latin translation from Cassiodorus. And could you give us perhaps some insight into why Cassiodorus, when he translated a lot of these subject Greek terms, like what we saw, I'm going to share back on screen, right, that we could give these negative glosses to, when he translates those same terms elsewhere in Josephus' corpus, they're negative. And so my point in bringing that up is that this translation here that you provide is not some sort of out of context way of understanding Josephus, but the negative connotations of these words were well understood from people that were translators in the ancient era. And so could you maybe give us some insight into how the evidence of Cassiodorus shows that there was an awareness of how this passage could be understood negatively, and perhaps how then they tried avoiding that on purpose?
Cassiodorus is this fascinating case. He wrote around the year in the 500s, towards the very end of the 500s, early 600s. He was a man of enormous erudition. He knew Greek, which was quite rare for a Latin writer of that era to have known Greek. And he commissioned a translation of Josephus's Antiquities. He had a team working on it. You know, it's 300 something thousand words. This is not something that most individuals would ever be able to pull off on their own. And what's interesting, what scholars have noticed before my book, was that as Cassiodorus and his team are trolling through the antiquities, they come to the Testimonium Flavianum in book 18, and they do something really weird. They, instead of translating the passage as it stands, they go and they borrow Rufinus's previous Latin translation of the passage and insert that in there. And that brought up all sorts of questions. Why did they do that? They're clearly capable of translating Greek. They've plowed through 300-something thousand words of very difficult Greek. And they come to this passage and they borrow from Rufinus's previous version. And scholars, hypothesize what's going on here. And one idea was that, well, maybe the passage was very negative. Maybe it actually said something quite different than what the current passage says. That was one idea. Another idea was that the passage just wasn't there to begin with, and so they tried to insert it. The problem with that theory is that, remember that ancient writers, they weren't working with chapter and versification numbers like we have today. So all they would have known about the passage from Rufinus and from Eusebius and other sources is that it was located somewhere in book 18. They would not have been able to place it in the precise location where we find they did. So what this means probably is that they didn't exactly like what they saw in the original Greek. But I think, far from them finding some, bizarre negative version that we no longer have in Greek, I think they found the exact Greek passage we have today. And as you mentioned, Craig, that's because if you go and look at the same words and phrases that Josephus uses in the Testimonium Flavianum, and you look how he translates those words and phrases, how Cassiodorus translates those words and phrases when Josephus uses them elsewhere, you see that all of a sudden he takes several of these quite negatively. So the Greek word epagomai, which scholars often translate as lead, so Jesus led many Jews and Greeks, or he brought over. Cassiodorus will sometimes translate it negatively as like he induced people, or he persuaded people to come over. The same goes with that phrase "with pleasure." That other Latin Rufinus takes that phrase and tries to make it positive. They gladly receive this, but elsewhere, Cassiodorus understands the potentially negative implications of this phrase. And there's several other examples of this where it becomes clear that if Cassiodorus just imported that method of translating those phrases into the Testimonium Flavianum, it would become the negative passage, or at least the neutralish negative passage that I put down in my book. And I think that explains what happened. Is they saw the passage, they didn't really like it, and so they borrowed Rufinus's more positive rendering of the passage in order so that they wouldn't distract, their readers.
Now, here's why, though, this is so compelling. We have the passage independently preserved in the Syriac. And so to presume that this was something that was added because he found it missing makes less sense when we have other textual traditions that preserve it that have nothing to do with the Latin West. Yeah. So there's that. There's the fact that Eusebius, in rendering the same passage, uses terminology like the word tis was thought to be, that's missing from the renderings of Rufinus and Jerome. So this again means that, well, this passage, with even some negative connotations, we know pre-exist Jerome and Rufinus in the Greek. And so these suspicions of yours have more justification, the textual evidence, than simply maybe the ad hoc explanation. Well, it must have just not been there. And so they just borrowed it from somewhere else. Because now we can't explain, how's it in the Syriac? How's it in Eusebius? The explanation that preserves all the textual witnesses tends to be the strongest one in text criticism. Is that not so?
I agree. And I think that Eusebius is a particularly interesting case because is that Myth Vision? Hey, Derek, I'm glad you're watching. Eusebius is an interesting case because he is sometimes accused of being the very person who changed the passage. That the first person to quote the passage is actually the person who changed it. But there's several lines of evidence which are strongly indicate that that's not the case. One of them is what you just mentioned, that Eusebius actually preserves a negative phrase, a certain Jesus, and other people shy away from preserving that. And in fact, that particular phrase is not in the manuscripts of the antiquities. So here we have an example of if Eusebius was altering the passage to make it more positive, why would he have kept that phrase in there? He would have omitted it, but he didn't. He kept it in there. And there's several other instances of this. Another is with that phrase that in the negative version, I translate as magical deeds. In the neutral version, I say incredible deeds. And then in the positive version, I say miraculous deeds. We don't have a great English word to sum up the ambiguity of the original Greek, but the original Greek is paradoxa. And twice when Eusebius quotes the Testimonium Flavianum, this passage about Jesus, he cautions the reader about this word, paradoxa. And he says, I know some people are going to say that Jesus only worked paradoxa with the help of wizardry or sorcery or magic or something, because he knows that this word is freighted with potentially negative connotations. And what's interesting is that when other Greek writers will quote the same passage, they will comment on it and they'll change that word. They want it to say something else. They want it to be a little more positive, but Eusebius preserves it. So he seems a very unlikely candidate for altering the passage.
And we also just don't have evidence that he was altering many other passages in his history. He sometimes misinterprets things he's quoting, but he seems to be pretty honest with what he's taking from Origen's library and using and making his history. But let me say this as a non-scholar, at least in Greek. The term paradoxa sounds like the word paradox. I would say in English, we already have this sort of intuition that something that's a paradox it's more ambiguous. It wouldn't seem to be an unqualified good thing. Would that be the same sort of intuition a Greek scholar would look at the same term?
We always have to be careful to define words by their etymology, because that doesn't always work out. Etymology is a very, very useful line of evidence for defining words, but it's not always a good way. So in this case, it is semi-reliable. I mean, paradox, if someone is working paradoxes, that it causes you to sort of pause and try and figure out, well, what does that even mean? And I think the word in Greek paradoxa would have had a similar reaction, where people would have had a pause and tried to figure out, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? But it would have communicated a different nuance. In English, a paradox is like an impossibility or a contradiction. In Greek, paradoxa is some strange supernatural deed. It could be a good thing. It could be this surprising, incredible thing, but often it's associated with wizardry or magic. This is something that an ancient Jewish source that is viciously hostile to Jesus. It's called the Jew of Celsus. He's writing around the year 150. He accuses Jesus of being a magician. He says he went to Egypt and he learned their wicked sorceress crafts there. And he describes Jesus's miracles as paradoxa, with the same exact word that Josephus does. So I think that Greek scholars, when they're seeing that word paradoxa, you could make it positive, but more likely it's an ambiguous term, even a negative term. And this is something that Bible translators have recognized for a long time. Paradoxa is only used once in the New Testament, which is, of course, written in Greek. And it's in the Gospel of Luke. And if you look at how modern biblical translations translate the term, they often will use the word strange deeds, because they're trying to highlight this negative valence of the term. And I think that's a good way to understand it. I think that that's something that Josephus probably meant to communicate, that he's unclear about where Jesus's supernatural power is coming from.
We're having some lag here. I'm sorry, Dr. Schmidt.
No problem. I hope it's not on my end.
I'm pretty sure it's mine, so I'll take the blame. So we mentioned the term "tis." Um, how much blame can be laid upon Greek scribes removing the word "tis," which is like a certain Jesus, from most manuscripts, for people thinking that this whole passage is an interpolation? Because we know the word "tis" is in Eusebius, it's in the equivalents in the Syriac, the equivalents in the Slavonic. Um, but most people's interaction lack that with this text lacks a certain Jesus, which already kind of puts this on a negative footing. So how much do you think that's affected the scholarly view of this passage until today?
It's also in the Armenian, so it's translated in many other translations. But you're right, in the three manuscripts of the Antiquities, it's missing. And it's also missing from many of Eusebius's manuscripts, although it is in the earliest and best Greek manuscript of the ecclesiastical history. And it's also in the Syriac translation of the ecclesiastical history. So clearly Eusebius used it. So this brings up the question, was this a conscious omission by Christian scribes? Did they not like that, so they took it out? And if so, does that mean that they did that at other times too? And I think that the answer to that is, I think probably some scribe along the way did omit it because it was just so negative. Um, Regarding whether that means this was a systematic effort to purify the passage, I don't think so. And that's because there's just other negative stuff there. I mean, if they were willing to do that, how come they didn't change the other stuff? And furthermore, we clearly have instances of scribes who are willing to preserve that negative term. Eusebius preserves it. Later scribes do, because we have manuscript witnesses that preserve it. We also have translations that preserve it: the Syriac, the Armenian, the Slavonic. And so I think that there may have been a scribe that consciously omitted the term. It could have been accidental. I mean, tis is a very, very small term. It's easy to skip it. Um, but I don't think that that kind of tampering would have extended to the rest of the passage, simply because why would they leave all the other stuff there?
Now, let me ask this. A lot of passage translations say that Christ led many from among the Jews and many among the Greeks. He was the Christ.
Mhm.
But you have, he was thought to be the Christ. And the Greek term, I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, be Leiomenos, was called. Um, and you argue it should be added to the critical reconstructions of the Greek of Eusebius. So my question would be why?
In the Greek antiquities, in the manuscripts we have, the original Greek at that particular phrase just reads, "He was the Christ." And looking at that, it seems impossible for Josephus to have said that, because that would make Josephus a Christian, and we know he wasn't a Christian. He was Jewish. So this is the primary one of the primary reasons why people have thought that Josephus didn't write this passage. And I started my book thinking that this was a very good argument, and I still do think it's a good argument. The issue, though, is that that's not what all our textual witnesses say the passage communicates. So the three antiquities manuscripts say he was the Christ, but Jerome's Latin translation, which he made around the year 393, instead says that he was believed to be the Christ. And then the Syriac translation by Jacob of Edessa, done around the year 700, he says he was thought to be the Christ. And Jacob doesn't know Latin. He wouldn't have been using Jerome's Latin translation, which would have been, Latin. The lingua franca, or the area where Latin was the lingua franca, is hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where Jacob is located. So clearly, Jacob and Jerome are using Greek manuscripts of the antiquities that don't say he was the Christ. They say something else, like he was considered to be the Christ. And that feels a lot more plausible. It also matches what Josephus says about Jesus elsewhere. He mentions Jesus one more time in a very brief reference, where instead of saying Jesus the Christ or Jesus was the Christ, he says Jesus who was called the Christ. So that's a third line of evidence. This sounds like something Josephus would have said. So taking those two witnesses, the Latin on one hand and the Syriac on the other, I think we can triangulate what the original reading was. Having said that, though, in the original Greek, the phrase "he was the Christ" doesn't sound nearly as much of a confession of faith as it does in English. In Greek, you often use the definite pronoun before someone's name. So in English, we don't go around saying the Craig, the Tom. You do in ancient Greek. And so it would be much easier for people to view that as simply a name. The word Christos in ancient Greek did not have a specifically religious connotation. That is something that Christianity imparted to the Greek language. So in ancient times, it would look like it could easily look like either Josephus is just giving an alternative name for Jesus, or it could look like, yeah, he's giving some kind of title, but it's not a specifically religious title. It's not saying he's the anointed one of the Jews necessarily. It's just something that Christians call this guy for whatever reason. Christos is the adjectival participial form of chrio, meaning to smear or to anoint. And of course, in English, if I say I smear someone, that doesn't have any religious connotations. If I say I anoint someone, that starts getting there. But in Greek, pre-Christian Greek and early Christian times, this word wasn't specifically religious. So having said that, the phrase isn't as flagrantly pro-Christian as it seems in its altered state. It actually, you could read it in just the same sense as thought to be the Christ. This is just another name. This is just another name for Jesus.
Now, let me ask about the scholarly consensus, so to say. Perhaps that's overturned now. But when did the scholarly consensus that this passage is inauthentic, when did that originate? And has any serious work preceding yours questioned it?
It originated a long time ago. Already by the 1700s, scholars were questioning this passage significantly. And by the 1800s, late 1800s, it was pretty much universally thought that the passage was inauthentic. And the first turn came with a scholar named Henry Thackeray. He was the one who was responsible for translating many of those wonderful Loeb classical volumes from Greek into English about 100 years ago. And he thought that the passage was forged, like almost all of his contemporaries. But after spending years working through Josephus's writings in Greek, he changed his mind. And he said, actually, there's just so many passages in the Testimonium Flavianum that I can find elsewhere in Josephus's work. There's turns of phrase, there's word usage. It just sounds like Josephus. So he changed his mind and thought that the passage was either authentic or maybe authentic with some alterations here or there, but that in large part it was authentic. That changed the trajectory of scholarship so that most scholars, the consensus up to roughly the present, has been that Josephus did say something, probably something like the passage that we have, but there's been some alterations that have been made. Some scholars will say there's more severe alterations. Others will say they're more minor. But 20 years ago, things started changing again. There was a couple scholars started using early Greek databases. They started dabbling with some databases to do complex word searches. And they started realizing that there was even more parallels between the works of Josephus and the passage than was originally thought. And so you have scholars like Alice Wheely, the French scholar Bardet, where they started to argue more and more towards authenticity, that the passage, when all the textual witnesses are considered, the passage is either completely authentic or probably completely authentic or almost that way. And I pick up on that And in my book, I harvest databases heavily. I try to do as comprehensive a job as possible. And what happens, all these additional, even more parallels between the passage about Jesus and other areas in Josephus's works emerge, so much so that it just seems impossible, absolutely impossible, that Josephus didn't write most of the passage. It's just not something an ancient writer would be able to manufacture. It's actually something that I don't think any human would be able to do without the help of modern databases, which of course didn't exist back in antiquity or the medieval time frame.
And so, just so the audience is aware, using these databases and looking at the particular vocabulary of Josephus and the comparative vocabulary of the passage, and then statistically comparing how often certain words should come up compared to the rest of his corpus, it becomes nearly statistically impossible that a forger could strike that idiolect so well to get those words. And well, one, I'll just stick with that. It makes it very improbable that someone could falsify a passage that well. But like we were saying before, the fact that this passage is preserved in many different witnesses that had no relation with one another verifies its textual existence as well, so that even if we're going to take maybe the more moderate view that, oh, well, the passage as a whole is authentic, but maybe certain parts were doctored here and there, becomes less tenable because of the independent textual variants, which agree with in all the important details. And so that makes it even more difficult because in a sense, you have hostile witnesses that all say the same thing. And so that preserves a document that otherwise we would not be sure, like something like the Quran, which has less textual diversity, is correct. But let me ask you this, because this gets at the larger topic of text criticism. Before the advent of databases, I mean, I heard this, 20 years ago, cutting my teeth in text criticism, which is that, oh, we know St. Paul didn't write X letter or Y letter because it doesn't sound like him. And so my argument is, how good could we make those sort of arguments before the advent of databases?
That's a good question. If you look at the field of forensic authorship analysis, this is the field that does this for a living. They do it in criminal cases, they do it in civil cases, where you have a document, and for whatever reason, you need to prove or disprove that someone authored the document. So there's a whole field dedicated to this, and they have some rigorous ways of doing things like this. But one of the issues is that it turns out it's actually really hard to prove someone did or did not author a document. And you can.
So you're saying that in criminal law, it borders in pseudoscience, like the lie detector test?
I wouldn't say pseudoscience. I would just say
because
it's really hard.
Because I can tell you from a criminal justice vantage point, it's almost impossible to prove falsified signatures and stuff like that. People get from TV, there's handwriting experts, and people can know if someone else wrote something. And in reality, it's so highly subjective, it's almost always inadmissible in the court of law.
I mean, here's what I'll say, is that the conditions that are required to make a really, really good case that someone didn't write something is very, very hard to pull off in the ancient world. And I'm talking purely about style. Claims is a different thing. Content is a different matter, but simply based on style, then it's hard. And here's the reason why. It's because in order to make this argument, you need to have a vast authenticated corpus by which to compare the document. It needs to be vast. So you can't just use a few thousand words. We're talking hundreds of thousands of words.
Yes.
At a minimum. That's immediately going to exclude the vast, vast majority of ancient authors. Another thing you need to make sure that the document in question was written under similar circumstances as the main corpus. that again is sometimes impossible to figure out. Authors who have hundreds of thousands of words preserved, like Augustine, he's writing over 40 years. He's writing under radically different circumstances. He's writing in different genres. He's writing letters. He's doing sermons. He's doing all sorts of different stuff. He's having debates that are being written down. So all of this you have to factor in. Certainly, Craig, if you were dragged before a court and they were trying to, and you needed to prove that you actually did or didn't do something, and let's say it's a text message, you'd be really upset if they were using your published college essays when
Or these
you wish
books.
that they were using something else. Yeah. So you'd want them to use like for like. Now, in contemporary settings, sometimes you can do that. Sometimes you say, look, this text message was sent by so-and-so, or this email chain, and we have 1 million words of emails this person has been writing from their job over the past 5 years. So sometimes you can do that. Sometimes I think you can do it in the ancient world. It's just really, really hard. And for someone like, you brought up Paul the Apostle. It's so hard. We don't have hundreds of thousands of words from him. He's writing from prison sometimes. Sometimes he's writing clearly from a wealthy patron's house. He's got scribes that are helping him. I mean, it's just very, very difficult to show that he couldn't or wouldn't have written something based on what we have remaining.
And again, it's because your appreciation for the difficulty of it comes from dealing with hundreds of thousands of words from Josephus, and even then having to maintain a healthy skepticism that simply the idiolect alone proves the case, which is why we started discussing this with manuscripts and things to that effect. That it shows, we have the other basis for the textual existence of this passage.
Yeah.
Now, being that it was hard to appreciate how important these databases were in order to really nail down the importance of some of these terminologies and how they reflect the authenticity of someone. We've had a lot in text criticism and in the history of early Christianity, things like the Jesus Seminar, which would presume that, all right, a lot of these texts don't sound like they're written by the same people because of how they sound. Now we know that you need a little more evidence than that to do that. But also the idea that, well, if it's miraculous, it's more likely made up later because it shows that it's embellished over time. But your research shows whether or not you think the miracles vindicate Christ or not, because your translation shows that's actually a topic that's worthy of debate. That we have someone that historically records, at least imputed to Christ, were these miraculous things and resurrection and things that before people had a skepticism whether or not someone writing in the 30s, 40s, or 50s would have reported these details about Christ. So if, this is now the question, if the passage in Josephus is in fact original, whether it's positive, negative, whatever it is, if it's in fact original, does this upend that methodology that was so popular in maybe the mid to early late 20th century of trying to infer how early a text of the gospel or passage of the gospel was? Does this upend Jesus Seminar like scholarship?
I think you put your finger on something very important where, freighted throughout much of scholarship in the 20th century was this idea that A, miracles don't happen, and B, therefore, if we have reports of miracles, this means they must be later exaggerations. They couldn't have been contemporary with the source. And what I would say is regarding point B, that Josephus, I think, disproves that. You can be, if you want to, I am not a materialist, but you can be a materialist and wholeheartedly believe that Jesus during his lifetime was thought to work miracles, that people were talking about the miracles of Jesus in his lifetime. So even if materialism, assumption A, is true, it doesn't follow that the reports are late or that the stories are late. And you see examples of this, for instance, with the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is just miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. And Most scholars will say that the Gospel of John, actually, pretty much all scholars, liberal or conservative, say the Gospel of John is later, but it's got less miraculous stuff in it. So they don't even really follow their own rationale with many of these their reconstructions. So I think that this passage by Josephus shows that people were considering Jesus to be a wonder worker during his lifetime, and that his enemies acknowledge this. This is what the Gospels say. That the Pharisees and the high priests accused him of doing miraculous deeds with the help of demons, for instance. This is also what other non-Christian sources tell us. The Jew of Celsus said that he worked these paradoxa with the help of magic. The very hostile Jewish biography, the Toldoth Yeshu, describes Jesus resurrecting people and healing people, but again, with the aid of demons. There's pagan sources that very freely admit that he did work wonders, but they, of course, thought that Jesus was getting some kind of power from, other gods in the pagan pantheon. So this is something that pretty much everybody believed about Jesus. And I don't think that belief in the miracles of Jesus is a call or a good rational grounds to assume that the stories must be late. I think it actually could imply they're early.
Now, let me ask this. How do we know that Josephus was a reliable secondary source to begin with? He could have simply just hearing, there's these Christians out there, these wacky ideas. They kind of think this, I think. Do we have any justification to know that he had more firsthand knowledge from reputable sources in their day that would have had direct interaction with Jesus?
Yes, I think that we can trust Josephus for several reasons. One is that Josephus has no problem with accusing people of being a false prophet, of accusing someone of being a pretender, of lying, of deceiving. He laughs at witches and stuff like that. So he's very capable of denying someone's alleged supernatural claims. But he doesn't do that with Jesus. That's interesting. Secondly, if we examine Josephus's sources, where is he getting this information about Jesus? I think we can show that he has an extraordinary connection with people who knew Jesus, that were not Christians, that were Jesus's
So let
enemies.
me stop you there. Josephus, as a secondary source, would have relied on primary sources from people that actually knew the historical Jesus. How do we know this?
Yeah, I think he would have. There's several interlocking data points that lead to this conclusion. One is the circumstances behind Josephus. He's not just some random source writing in 94 AD. He tells us in his own words, he was born in Jerusalem in 37 AD. He was born to an eminent priestly family. He was born to a family of royal descent as well. He was raised to be a priest. He also became a Pharisee. He was stationed in Galilee in the 60s. He visited places Jesus walked. He went to Capernaum. He went to Cana. He went to Tiberias. He lived
So
3 miles down the road
So he was a
from Nazareth.
general occupying Galilee where there would have been the original Christians.
Potentially, he was living in Jerusalem and Galilee anywhere between 10, 20, 30 years after Jesus was living in those and preaching in those same locations. So obviously he could have come across people who had met Jesus. The question is, how likely is it? And I actually think that other data shows it's quite likely.
Well,
And
tell us how.
that's because Josephus says in the Testimonium Flavianum that it was the first men who accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. This seems to agree with the Gospels, who describe the chief priests and the Pharisees colluding together to accuse Jesus before Pontius Pilate. That
And
word
so
that
first
Josephus
men is a
used,
Greek terminology
Yeah.
that means someone up there in the hierarchy, important
Yeah.
people.
Yes, very, very
Okay.
important political or religious individuals. And he uses that term many times. The Greek is protoi, the first ones. And several times he uses it are in his autobiography where he's talking about his life. And he says in 51 or 52 AD that he knew the protoi of Jerusalem. And he repeats this several times throughout his career, that I knew the protoi. He's familiar with them. In fact, he says, I was constantly interacting with the protoi. He uses the word constantly, continually.
And so he makes mention in this passage about the historical Jesus that the first among the Jews, the protoi, were making accusations to Pilate. But elsewhere in the Antiquities, he says, I know the protoi.
He says it elsewhere in a different work, in the autobiography. So he wrote an autobiography of his own life where he uses the same term, and he says, I knew these people and that I was continually meeting with them. And we know from his background, he, of course, would have. He knew high priests. I mean, his father was close friends with one of the high priests.
Let's name names.
So there's several names. I'll give you the most obvious candidate. The most obvious candidate that Josephus knew, who could or would, and I think did, know and interact with Jesus, was Josephus's commander in the Jewish war. His commander was a man named Ananus II. He was high priest in 62 AD. He lost his high priesthood because he executed James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, as we know this because this is what Josephus tells us. So his commander had James, whom in Christian tradition we call the Apostle James. He wrote the first letter, the letter of James. He had him executed, so he's intimately involved in the Jesus movement. Josephus's commander is, in a hostile way. And what Josephus tells us further about his commander is very revealing, because it turns out that his commander was the brother-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, who the four Gospels say was the man who accused Jesus.
So let me emphasize,
Pontius Pilate.
Josephus' commander was the brother-in-law of Caiaphas himself.
Yes.
Do we have any other connections that, there's 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon, so this is 2 degrees. Do we have any other 2-degree connections between Josephus and people there at the trial of Jesus?
Potentially, yes. There's another individual he knows named Simon. Simon was the head of the Sanhedrin around 60, 65, 70 AD. And Simon's father was Rabbi Gamaliel. Rabbi Gamaliel is mentioned in the book of Acts. He presides over a Sanhedrin trial of the apostles. And Gamaliel, we know from other sources, was also head of the Sanhedrin. And if you read that passage in the book of Acts, Peter says, you killed Jesus. So, in other words, Gamaliel seems to have been involved in the trial of Jesus. And that makes sense, because if he was head of the Sanhedrin in 30 AD, the entire Sanhedrin had to assemble at the trial of Jesus. So he would have been there. So here we have Josephus has a acquaintance, Simon, whose father was also at the trial of Jesus, just like how Ananus II, Josephus's commander, his brother-in-law, was at the trial of Jesus. And I neglected to mention this, his commander's father was Annas, who was high priest emeritus, who was also at the trial of Jesus.
So we just named, I'm losing count, 4 or 5 people, 2 degrees of separation.
Yes, it depends how we trace it out. It's Simon.
How about Josephus' father himself? Right, he's a son of a priest, a son of a Pharisee. Where do we situate Josephus' own father?
He could have been one of the first men. Here's what we can say about Josephus' father. Josephus' father was of enormous prominence in Jewish religious circles. He was a priest. He was 25 years old when Jesus was crucified. Because he was a priest and because he was from Jerusalem, he would have been in Jerusalem during the trial, A, because he was from Jerusalem, but B, because the trial happened over Passover. Passover is a pilgrimage feast when Jews are required to go to Jerusalem, and priests especially are required to be there. So his father would have been there. His father was intimately connected with certain high priests. In fact, there was a high priest named Joshua who risked a lot to tell Josephus's father about some plot against him. So he clearly was associated with the highest of the highest ranking priests. And he's another possibility. I mean, it's possible he was there. Certainly, he would have known about the trial. He would have known about this Jesus guy and could have easily communicated that to Josephus. Josephus tells us his father was still living in the late 60s. So Josephus is more than 30 years old. His father is still alive. His mother is still alive. We could say much the same about his mother as well. So these are just people we know about. There's any number of dozens of others whom Josephus could have encountered who would have met Jesus either in Galilee or in Jerusalem. I go through about 10 or 11 possible candidates in my book.
Well, the point of tracing out the ones that we did here is that people have this sort of idea that maybe Josephus heard a bunch of cranks in the middle of the countryside and who, they could believe any sort of crazy thing. But for Josephus to record this, knowing what we know, that he was closely connected to people that would have been very closely connected personally through family, if not there in the case of his father, perhaps, that it's not that he just heard some random cranks. It's more likely he would have heard this through perhaps the most reputable first-person sources of his day, because they would have considered the first of the Jews to be the most reputable people. Now, that being the case, a lot of people are probably less interested in Josephus and Saint James, but I always found the passage interesting because it seems to give it a positive or at least neutral gloss, like the idea that there were Jews that came to the defense or at least were perturbed by what happened to James. And so my question is, what does this imply about the standing of Christians within Judaism before 70 AD, where there would have been a faction of Jews, I believe were Pharisees, that were actually kind of supportive or at least perturbed that James was treated as he was?
I think that's very insightful. The passage that you're referring to is sort of an incidental remark about James. The passage as a whole is a description of the reign of Ananus II as high priest, who would go on to be Josephus's own commander in the Jewish army. And he's trying to explain why Ananus II lost his priesthood. And in order to explain that, he has to say that he has to tell us this little story about how Ananus II brought James, in Josephus's words, James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, forward and gathered the Sanhedrin, accused James and some others of being lawbreakers, in his words, and had them stoned to death. And he was able to do this because the Roman governor had died and the governor's replacement was still on the way. So there was sort of a power vacuum. And when the new governor showed up, he was furious at this breach of Roman laws, and he ended up having Ananus defrocked. He lost his high priesthood. But as you say, there were some other Jews at the time that were upset over how James was treated. And so we can tell several things from even though this passage is very brief, we can derive a few interesting historical details. One, there were some leading Jews that were upset over how James was treated. This implies that even if they disagreed with him, they certainly didn't hate him enough to not defend him. They wanted to defend him, number one. Number two, Christianity and James himself was of such prominence that Ananus II, the high priest, was willing to risk his priesthood to have James illegally executed, which is remarkable. It says something about the position and status of James and the early Jesus movement, the early Christian movement, for Ananus II to do something like that. And then thirdly, what does Josephus say? Well, it's interesting. As you say, he's not very negative about James. He says he was accused as a lawbreaker, but then he says that it was actually Ananus II who was breaking laws. It's not, super positive. He doesn't come out and defend James, but he's certainly not negative towards James. He just sort of tells the story and moves on. And so this is interesting because it's suggestive of how Josephus would have spoken of Jesus. Another line of evidence in this regard is John the Baptist. Josephus also talks about John the Baptist, and he loves the guy. He says very, very positive things about John the Baptist. This is probably because John the Baptist sounds a lot like an Essene, and Essene was another group like the Pharisees and Sadducees. Josephus loves the Essenes. John the Baptist has a lot of at least superficial similarities to Essenes. For all we know, he could have been one, just like Paul the Apostle was a Pharisee. I mean, there's no reason that John the Baptist couldn't have been an Essene at some point. So he likes John the Baptist. Josephus likes him. He doesn't seem to be overly hostile to James. And that tells us that, like, we wouldn't expect him to be overly positive about Jesus. He wasn't that way for James, but we also wouldn't expect this unremittingly hostile account. And I think, properly read, the Greek account that remains is what we would expect. It's this kind of ambiguous account. You could take it negatively, just like you could take the James passage negatively. Oh, he was accused of being a lawbreaker and was executed. But you could also take it a little bit positively, just like how you could take the James passage potentially a little bit positively. But notice that Josephus doesn't say these outlandishly pro-Christian things about James. And I don't think he says the same thing about Jesus, properly understood.
Now I just want to comment real quick that a lot of the ancient writers in the recount Josephus and James seem to think that Josephus had a very positive view of James, and almost seems like an ancient Mandela effect, because they seem to be conflating Hegesippus with Josephus. But because the Josephus account, I think, comes off more positive than neutral, to be perfectly frank. You can see how maybe that ancient Mandela effect, before the Mandela effect, took place. But anyway, that aside, let me ask, what other sources do you suspect your methodology, which again, you didn't invent, but the methodology of data mining will help vindicate the authenticity of?
Well, I haven't sat down and made a list. I mean, I'm open, send me some sources. We can try to do the same thing with it. But I do think that these databases are opening up new avenues for research, and they can open up avenues for authenticating materials. They can open up avenues for falsifying materials. I mean, you could conceivably do the very opposite with this methodology. I also think that you can try to find lost works with this methodology. I mean, you see with AI and scanning technology, they're trying to read sources that we can't read with the naked eye. Burnt scrolls from Herculaneum, from Pompeii. Those rely on databases, because the AI software has to have a massive database of ancient Latin or ancient Greek works with which to try and reassemble what it's reading. It's the same thing we would do if we could actually see bits of the writing. You would take known passages and see, I bet this is the word "and" here, and this is the word "the," to try and reconstruct a sentence. We would be doing the same thing, but we can't visibly see these markings like some of these scans can. So there's all sorts of possibilities out there. I'm in the process of assembling and publishing the lost fragments of Hippolytus of Rome on Revelation. And I'm using databases to do this, where I'm looking for lost quotations of Hippolytus in order to try and reassemble what Hippolytus thought about the book of Revelation. And this would be the earliest commentary on Revelation we have preserved, which is pretty interesting. It'd be from the year 200, 220. So I'm trying to do that as we speak. There's many other things that could be done. So I exhort your readers: study Greek, study Latin, get involved, study Syriac, study Armenian, Arabic. All of these languages have numerous opportunities for doing work like this, and you need to have
And
some
hit the
computer know how to do
databases.
it. Yeah.
It's in Ge'ez. I think there's a lot in Ge'ez that we
Tons.
can't even contemplate yet.
I know, tons.
But I think the methodology, we've done a lot of it, particularly Evangelos Nikopoulos on Dionysius the Areopagite. So again, this methodology could further prove the thesis, or at least bring light to maybe where that thesis goes short. So it's very important methodology. When's the earliest you've seen the methodology of data mining digital historical texts? When did that start?
I mean, in its infancy, I mean, there was I forget the date of the work, but there was an article I came across where someone did sort of a proto version of this, and I think it was in the 80s, but it was very rudimentary. So the searches, searching is much more complicated than just assembling a database and typing in a word. With Greek especially, words can take dozens and dozens of different visible forms with different endings. You want to do complex grammatical searches where you're saying, I would like, a definite article followed by a proper noun, followed by a verb in this particular tense. I mean, those are very complicated searches that assembling a database alone won't let you do. You have to have all sorts of other facility. So people were starting to do things like this, but it was very rudimentary. What really broke it open was the advent of the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae database. And this is a paid database, but it's not horrifically expensive. I think it's $150 or $200 a year. Sounds like a lot of money, but keep in mind that some of these databases might cost like $10,000 a year. So it's relatively affordable. And they have digitized almost every single thing ever written in ancient Greek that still remains to this day. There are some
Oh,
exceptions.
that's
They're
not that
working
much.
on. Yeah, millions and millions and millions and millions of words up to like the year 1400. So that's what I used when I was writing chapter 1 of my book. I wanted to find every single instance a Greek writer quoted from the Testimonium Flavianum and look at what that writer said. So what I do is I go and I type in a passage from the Testimonium Flavianum, click search, and this is a very basic search because you're just looking for a straight string of words. And I get all these results, and you carefully go through them, you track down the passages, you translate them, and you see what you get. And what I found was that these Greek authors weren't looking at the passage by and large as this incredible pro-Christian thing. They thought of it as relatively mundane, and it gave me the clue that maybe scholars have been misreading this passage.
Well, we're running out of time, so I want to ask you a really crucial macro question, which is, with these sort of discoveries like yours, at what point will tradition be acknowledged as generally reliable? I'm not trying to be dogmatic here, right? I'm trying to say there gets to a point where we start questioning everything. And then when we take more serious looks at the evidence, you start realizing, they weren't wrong for those 15, 16, 17 centuries. They had some justification for this. Now we could textually critically see why. And so are we reaching the point with technology, and soon we're going to see with AI and with the methodology being honed, because people will build on your work and your methodology and will improve the methodology, that perhaps the 2-century long moment in history of text criticism being something that's considered skeptical, are we going to see that reverse itself, you think?
Hopefully, hopefully that I think that scholarship has been too skeptical. I think it's been rooted in these naturalistic, materialistic viewpoints. It's also rooted in skepticism over any traditionally held belief. So if a belief is traditionally held, it's given enormous scrutiny. But if a similar belief is not traditionally held, it's often given a free pass. And I don't think that is a fair way to do any kind of intellectual pursuit. I think that scholars should be much more open to non-materialism, non-materialistic assumptions. I also think they should be open to traditional beliefs as well as non-traditional beliefs. I don't think that they should, just because something is traditionally believed, they should dismiss it. I'm hesitant to talk about tradition as a whole. I mean, that's a big category there. You got to start talking about like Hindu tradition and Buddhist tradition and atheist tradition. I mean, these are very large categories, and not all traditions are equal. You have a tradition that's been around for a couple hundred years. You have one that's been around for 4,000 years. I mean, these are different categories. So I would not say that tradition itself is going to be viewed as an inherently reliable vehicle, but I do think certain kinds of traditions can be viewed as reliable vehicles for communicating texts or happenings that happened in the distant past. We see this, you can see this in many cases. I mean, one example, you mentioned Ge'ez in Ethiopia. One example is the traditions that the Ethiopian church has about this famous manuscript or set of manuscripts, the Garima Gospels, which they claimed was it's illuminated gospel manuscript. There's 2 of them. and they claimed was from like the 5th or 6th century. Scholars dismiss this as absurd because Gez manuscripts are from like the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. It's 1,000 years earlier. And they were insistent, the Ethiopian church was insistent, no, the Abba Garima did this in the 5th or 6th century. Well, lo and behold, scholars went and took some radiocarbon dating from these manuscripts, and they didn't like what they saw, so they did it again. And they didn't like what they saw, so they did it again. And finally, it turns out after 2, 3, or even 4 radiometric testings that these manuscripts come back to about the 5th or 6th century. And the Ethiopic church was right. That's where they were from. So things like that happen. And I think that scholars shouldn't knee-jerk reject claims like that. They should simply they should treat them seriously and methodically investigate them in a way that it's warranted.
I'll say in this case, thanks to research, we have tradition vindicated. We have to return to the drawing board for a lot of the historical inquiry to the historical Jesus. A lot of presumptions made behind dating passages of the gospel, Q source, things like this. And I also think it gives people at least reason for pause that no huge belief system, whether it's Christianity, a huge belief system like Islam or something, that you can't get something that big and its entire origin story is completely bunk. That there's going to be something to the tradition that must be dealt with not dismissively, but there being a high burden of proof to overturn that tradition. Because I feel more serious historical inquiry vindicates that. That people in the past were just as smart, if not smarter than today. They just had worse tools. And now we're getting the tools to see, yeah, they sort of knew what they were talking about. So before we go, how about you tell people how they could get your text? We have I've never seen this before, $130 book, $130 book for free, downloadable, Oxford University Press. How do you like people to interact with your published work on this topic?
Thanks, Craig. You can get the book free online at josephusandjesus.com. The printed price is pretty high. It's an academically priced book. It's meant for academic libraries. However, the book is accessible. You don't need to know ancient languages to read it. You can download the PDF for free. That PDF was made freely available by a really, really generous donor who wants to remain anonymous. But it's unlimited, so there's no cap on the number of PDFs. So you can go to the website, josephusandjesus.com. If you're interested in supporting the book is being supported and promoted by an institute called the Institute for Christian Reflection that's trying to get more scholarship out like this, and I'll be working with them. You can check them out too.
That's excellent. And I want to also remind viewers, if this interview has been helpful and a real blessing, to please bless someone else by blessing the missionary work in Cambodia, which is why this channel exists. You can support the missionary work at Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below to support the mission. As I was saying, there's a PayPal, a Patreon for monthly donors, and also Venmo for those who would like to support the mission that way. Now, that being said, this has been positively great to peel some more layers, get into some more detail than what we have in the book. Forward to what you do with St. Hippolytus in the future, with the book of Revelation, and your future endeavors. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Craig. This was a great pleasure. God bless.
Now I'm going to end this stream and end all of them by quoting Jesus Sirach: "Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you." God bless you. Have a great day.